I am Sergeant Sonia Blair, 32 years old, with the 82nd Airborne Division. I learned how to survive in the most hostile environments in the world, but no one ever taught me how to fight a war in my own kitchen. That night, the cold linoleum floor was pressed against my cheek. The smell of cheap whiskey on my father-in-law Robert's breath made my stomach turn. His fist had just split my lip, and I could taste the salt of my own blood mixed with tears. Behind him, my mother-in-law, Eleanor, stood in judgment, her silence absolute. She wasn't looking at me with concern, but with a bone-deep contempt. "Sign it!" Robert snarled, shoving the deed transfer papers against my chest. Eleanor added, her voice sharp as a razor, "David is gone. This house is all that's left of him. You don't deserve it. You're just a mistake he left behind." They thought they had broken me, but they forgot one thing. A soldier cornered is never fighting alone, and my arsenal wasn't in the gun safe. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. Hit that like and subscribe button if you believe a home should be a sanctuary, not a battlefield, and get ready for a soldier's story of betrayal and justice. The air in the kitchen had been thick all evening, heavy with unspoken things. It clung to the savory smell of the meatloaf I'd made, David's favorite recipe, and made the silence between fork scrapes feel like a countdown. For weeks, ever since they had moved in temporarily after David's death, every meal had been a trial. But tonight was different. There was a coiled tension in Robert's shoulders, a predatory glint in Eleanor's eyes. It started not with a shout, but with the flat, sharp slap of paper on the oak dining table. "Deed transfer," Robert grunted, his voice a low rumble, fueled by the tumbler of whiskey, sweating in his hand. I looked at the stark, black and white legal document. My name, David's name, and a blank line waiting for my signature. I pushed my plate away, my appetite vanishing instantly. "Robert, we've talked about this," I said, keeping my voice soft, level. "This house? It's the last piece of him I have. It's our home." That was my mistake, using the word our. A guttural roar tore from his throat. It wasn't a human sound of anger, it was the sound of a beast finally unleashed. In one violent motion, he shoved the heavy oak table. It flipped with a scream of protesting wood, sending plates, glasses, and the remains of our dinner crashing to the floor. Porcelain shrapnel and meatloaf scattered across the linoleum. Eleanor didn't move a muscle. She stood by the counter, arms crossed over her chest, a silent, approving statue. Before I could even react, Robert was on me. His hand, thick and calloused from a lifetime of construction work, tangled in my hair, yanking my head back. The smell of whiskey was overpowering, hot and sour. "We let you stay here," he spat, his face inches from mine. That was good enough. The first punch wasn't a slap, it was a closed fist, a sledgehammer blow that connected with the side of my head. The world exploded into a nauseating swirl of white light and black spots. My ears rang with a high-pitched whine. The force of it threw me sideways, and my body slammed into the china hutch by the wall. The crash was deafening. The dishes inside, the ones David and I had picked out together, shattered. The sound echoed through the quiet suburban street like a series of gunshots. This wasn't an argument, it was an attack. As I lay on the floor, gasping, the cold of the tiles seeping through my shirt, Robert stood over me, his chest heaving. It was then, in that moment of chaos, that he did something that felt more violent than the punch. His heavy work boot came down on the splintered remains of our silver wedding frame that had been knocked from the hutch. He deliberately ground his heel into the glass, twisting it, destroying the smiling faces of David and me underneath. I watched it happen, a fresh wave of agony washing over me. But it was Eleanor's voice that cut me to the core. "Clean up this mess," she said, her tone flat and dismissive, as if she were talking about spilled milk. She stepped forward, her house slippers making no sound on the floor. While Robert was an instrument of brute force, Eleanor was the master of a more precise cruelty. She knelt, not to help me, but to get closer, to look directly into my eyes. Her voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, laced with venom. "Look at you," she hissed, her breath cool against my cheek. "So pathetic. lying in your own mess. Her eyes flickered over me with disgust. What would David think, seeing you like this? He would be so ashamed. She leaned in closer still. He deserved a stronger wife, not some weak freeloader clinging to his things. Her words were surgical strikes, aimed directly at the raw, gaping wound of my grief and guilt. Then she reached down and picked up a jagged shard of glass from the broken picture frame. She held it in front of my face, the piece of our wedding photo still stuck to it, showing half of David's smile. "See?" she whispered, her voice a razor. "Everything you touch breaks, my son. And now, his house." That hurt more than any physical blow ever could. It was a poison injected straight into my soul. But as the pain and humiliation crested, something else began to stir deep inside me. The part of me that was a wife, a daughter-in-law, was broken and bleeding on the floor. But the part of me that was Sergeant Sonia Blair of the 82nd Airborne was coming online. Pain is a signal. Assess, adapt, overcome. My training kicked in, an automatic response overriding the civilian shock. I didn't scream or sob. Wasted energy. I subtly shifted my body, curling inward, tucking my chin to my chest. I brought my arms up, one hand instinctively shielding my temple, the other covering the back of my neck. Protect the head, protect the spine, make yourself a smaller target. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, clear focus. My breathing, ragged moments before, evened out. Conserve oxygen, conserve energy. My eyes, though blurred with tears and the beginnings of a bloody haze from my split lip, began to scan, to record. Situational awareness, one overturned oak chair, a potential weapon or shield. Robert's position, 6 feet away, his back partially to me, breathing heavily. Eleanor standing near the sink, her face a mask of cold satisfaction. My cell phone, lying on the kitchen counter, its screen dark, 10 feet away. An impossible distance. This wasn't surrender. This was tactical patience. This was the moment in a Kandahar alleyway when you're pinned down by unseen fire. You don't charge blindly. You wait. You listen. You gather intel. You wait for the enemy to make a mistake. The paratrooper's motto is death from above. Lying there on the cold floor of my own kitchen, I twisted it. Life from below. I had to survive from the lowest possible point. Robert, enraged by my silence, by my refusal to be completely broken, turned. "You think you can just lie there?" he bellowed. He was looking for his next move, his rage demanding an encore. His eyes landed on the heavy, solid oak dining chair that had remained upright. He grabbed it, hoisting it high above his head with a grunt. The sheer weight of it made him stagger slightly. "I'll teach you to disrespect me in this house," he screamed, his face purple with fury. Eleanor didn't move. She didn't shout for him to stop. She didn't even flinch. She was going to let him do it. That was their mistake. In that split second, as the chair reached the apex of its arc, I knew this was my only chance. I gathered all the air in my lungs, not for a plea, but for a signal. I let out a scream. It wasn't a sound of terror, but a calculated auditory weapon, sharp, high-pitched, and piercing, designed to cut through walls and shatter the suburban quiet. The effect was instantaneous. Outside, Mr. Peterson's German Shepherd, Caesar, exploded into a frenzy of deep, ferocious barking. A moment later, we heard it. The unmistakable sound of tires screeching on the asphalt just down the street. A car had stopped short. Someone had heard. Robert froze, the heavy chair held precariously above his head. Eleanor's cold composure finally cracked, her eyes widening in panic. And then, a new sound joined the dog's barking, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. A mournful, rising and falling wail that every person, law-abiding or not, knows by heart. A siren. The ambush had failed. The battle for my home and my life was just beginning. The antiseptic smell of the hospital waiting room was a sharp contrast to the flood of memories filling my head. Sitting on the cracked vinyl chair, a sterile bandage taped to my temple, the chaos of my kitchen felt a world away. The police had come, taken statements, and an ambulance had brought me here for evaluation. Robert and Eleanor had put on a masterful performance of concern, spinning a tale of a clumsy fall. But in the quiet hum of the hospital, with the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, my mind wasn't on the lies or the violence. It was drifting back to the beginning. I remembered the day David and I first got the keys. The house was a simple, single-story, ranch-style home on a quiet street in suburban Fayetteville, nothing fancy. But to us, it was a kingdom. The afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows as David, laughing, swept me up and carried me over the threshold. His arms felt so strong, so safe. He smelled like sawdust and sunshine. "Welcome home, Sergeant Blair," he'd whispered, his voice full of a joy so pure it felt like it could light up the entire world. That first weekend was a blur of happy exhaustion. We spent hours rolling paint onto the beige walls, turning them a soft, hopeful color called sea salt. We argued playfully over which way the couch should face and spent an entire afternoon deciphering the cryptic instructions for a flat-pack bookshelf. We didn't even have a table yet, so we sat cross-legged on the hardwood floor, sharing a large pepperoni pizza straight from the cardboard box, our laughter echoing in the empty rooms. I remembered the sharp, clean smell of fresh paint, the sound of David's off-key humming to the radio, and the overwhelming feeling of absolute safety. That house wasn't just built of brick and mortar, it was built from our dreams, scraped together from our modest military paychecks. In a life defined by deployments and uncertainty, it was our anchor. David called it Outpost of Peace, our own private sanctuary where the noise of the world couldn't touch us. One spring afternoon, just before his last deployment, he'd planted a tiny oak sapling in the backyard. I remembered leaning against the doorframe, watching him gently firm the soil around its base. He'd looked up at me, his face smudged with dirt, and smiled that smile that always reached his eyes. "This little guy will grow up with our family, Sonny," he'd said, strong and steady, just like our love. The memory was so vivid, so warm, that the sudden shift back to the cold reality was like a physical blow. The image of David and his sapling dissolved, replaced by the memory of a police cruiser pulling up to that same house, its red and blue lights silently flashing, painting our peaceful outpost in colors of emergency and dread. The news of the training accident was a bomb that detonated in the center of my life, vaporizing everything I knew. The pain was a living thing, a predator that tore me apart from the inside out. I don't remember much about the days that followed, just a thick, gray fog of grief. At the funeral, Eleanor had clung to me, her sobs shaking both our bodies. "It's just us now, sweet girl," she choked out, her face buried in my shoulder. "We only have each other." Robert, standing stoic and grim in his dark suit, had placed a heavy, comforting hand on my shoulder. In the delirium of my sorrow, I believed them. I saw them not as in-laws, but as fellow survivors. Two people who understood the exact shape of the hole David had left behind. So when they suggested moving in, just for a little while, to help each other through the worst of it, I agreed without hesitation. It felt like the right thing to do, the only thing to do. I didn't realize I had just opened the gates of my fortress and invited the enemy inside. The occupation began subtly, a quiet campaign of territorial advancement. It started with Eleanor rearranging the furniture. The photos of David and me on the mantelpiece were slowly replaced by older pictures of him as a child. The Afghan I'd knitted and draped over the sofa was folded away, swapped for one of her own. "Just freshening the place up a bit, dear," she'd explain with a syrupy sweet smile. Giving the house some new life. Robert staked his claim on David's favorite brown leather recliner. He would sit there for hours, flipping through the sports channels David used to watch, a can of Budweiser perpetually in his hand, as if by occupying my husband's space, he could somehow fill the void. When I gently mentioned that it felt strange, that I wasn't ready for so much change, Eleanor had waved a dismissive hand. "Oh, Sonia, you're just being overly sensitive," she'd said, her voice laced with a patronizing pity. "We're only trying to help you move on." It was the first time I felt like a guest in my own home. The feeling only grew stronger. A few weeks later, Eleanor started complaining about the oak tree. "It's getting a bit overgrown, don't you think?" she'd remarked, peering out the kitchen window. "It really ruins the sightlines from the patio. We should probably have it taken down." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach, but I said nothing. The final insidious maneuver came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon. We were in the kitchen, and Eleanor was flipping through an old photo album. She paused on a picture of David as a teenager, all awkward limbs and a hopeful grin. She sighed, a sad, theatrical sound. "You know," she began, her voice soft and confiding, "David always told me. He said that if anything ever happened to him, his greatest wish was for his father and me to be taken care of in this house. He made me promise." The air left my lungs. I froze, the dish towel in my hand suddenly feeling like lead. David had never said that. Not to me. I knew my husband's heart. I knew his dreams. His dream was for us to grow old in this house, to watch that oak tree mature from our porch, to fill these rooms with the laughter of our own children. Eleanor's words weren't a mistaken memory. They were a calculated lie, a probing attack. It was the first round fired in a psychological war designed to plant seeds of guilt and doubt in my mind, to make me question my own right to be there. At our wedding, the pastor had quoted the vows, "In sickness and in health, till death do us part." I was beginning to understand that for Eleanor, David's death wasn't an ending, it was an opportunity. Later that evening, after they had gone to bed, I stood in the living room. The house felt different, alien. My eyes fell on the wall next to the hutch. There, marring the pale sea salt paint, was a spiderweb of cracks in the drywall, a fresh wound from where my body had hit it just hours before. My hand drifted up to touch it, and a memory surfaced with piercing clarity. David, paintbrush in hand, a streak of paint on his nose, carefully rolling that exact color onto that exact wall. The crack wasn't just in the wall, it was in everything. And I was standing right in the middle of it. The days that followed the night of the attack bled into one another, each a gray copy of the one before. The crack in the living room wall became a constant reminder of the fracture in my life. My home was no longer a sanctuary, it was occupied territory. My life had become a minefield, and I was learning to navigate it one cautious step at a time. The psychological warfare was relentless and waged on multiple fronts. Eleanor was the master strategist. She never raised her voice, never left a visible mark. Her weapons were quieter, more insidious. One afternoon, I came home from PT to the smell of scorched cotton. She was standing at the ironing board, a look of faux horror on her face. My favorite uniform shirt, the one I kept perfectly pressed for official functions, had a large, brown, iron-shaped burn mark right on the collar. "Oh dear," she'd sighed, her voice dripping with counterfeit regret. "My mind must have wandered. I am so sorry." A few days later, she'd forgotten to tell me that an old friend from my unit, Sarah, had called. I only found out when Sarah messaged me a week later, asking why I never called back. When I confronted Eleanor, she just patted my arm. "With everything you're going through, honey, I didn't want to bother you." Her call didn't seem important. She had appointed herself the gatekeeper of my life. Every dinner was a tribunal. My cooking, which David had always loved, was now subject to Eleanor's withering critiques. "This is a bit bland, isn't it?" she'd muse, pushing food around her plate. David always preferred his pot roast with more rosemary. One evening, she looked at my portion and said with a thin smile, "No wonder David got so thin when he was with you." Each comment was a small poisoned dart designed to erode my confidence and desecrate my memories. Robert's tactic was different. He used silence as a weapon of intimidation. He'd sit in David's recliner for hours, the blue light of the television flickering across his vacant face, nursing a beer. He wouldn't speak to me, but I would feel his eyes on me, a heavy, oppressive stare that made me feel like prey. The house, once filled with David's laughter and music, now suffocated under a blanket of hostility. The physical violence became more subtle, more deniable. It started about a week after the kitchen incident. I was walking down the hallway and Robert, coming the other way, accidentally shoved me hard against the wall. I stumbled, my elbow cracking against the doorframe. A A sharp, electric pain shot up my arm. Eleanor came rushing out of the living room, not to help me up, but to scold me. "Sonia, for heaven's sake, watch where you're going," she'd clucked. "You nearly made your father trip." I looked from her feigned concern to Robert's smirking face. In that moment, a cold, hard truth settled in my gut. No one would believe me. It would always be my word against theirs. That night, I locked myself in the bathroom and stood in front of the mirror. My elbow was already turning a mottled shade of purple and blue. The reflection in the mirror was of a woman I barely recognized. Her eyes were haunted, her face pale. But as I stared, the soldier looked back at me. If you don't have a witness, you become the witness. If you don't have evidence, you create it. I picked up my phone. The picture I took was blurry and poorly lit. A sad, ugly image of my own skin. But it was proof. It was the first entry in a new, secret logbook. My mission had begun. I developed a protocol. A standard operating procedure for survival. Every new bruise, every scratch from being accidentally pushed into a countertop was documented. I'd take the picture with that day's copy of the Fayetteville Observer visible in the corner, a timestamp they couldn't dispute. On my laptop, I created a hidden folder inside a dozen other mundane folders. I named it Recipes. Inside, I saved every image, every file meticulously labeled by date and incident. I was no longer a victim. I was an intelligence officer gathering intel behind enemy lines. But I knew Robert's fists were only half the battle. Eleanor's words were the true poison, and they left no visible scars. I needed proof of her manipulation. That's when my eyes fell on the teddy bear sitting on the bookshelf in the living room. It was a simple, plush brown bear named Barnaby that David had won for me at the state fair on our first Valentine's Day. With trembling hands, I took him down. He was a symbol of our innocent, happy love. And I was about to turn him into a spy. Using a small seam ripper from my sewing kit, I carefully opened a small section of the seam on his back. I took an old smartphone I no longer used, charged it fully, and set it to voice record. Then I gently tucked it deep inside the bear's stuffing. I stitched the seam back up, my fingers clumsy but determined. I placed Barnaby back on the shelf, angled just so, his little black button eyes staring out into the room. Every night, after they were asleep, I'd retrieve the phone. I'd go into the bathroom, lock the door, plug in my headphones, and listen to the day's recording. The first time I did it, my stomach churned with a mixture of fear and shame. But what I heard erased all doubt. I heard Eleanor on the phone with her sister, her voice dripping with malice. "She's so fragile, thinks we're just here to help. The little fool will sign anything if we push her hard enough." I heard Robert drunk and muttering to the TV, "One of these days, I'm gonna teach that girl a real lesson." Each recording was another bullet. I was slowly, methodically, loading my magazine. One night, I found a quote online from General George S. Patton. "Accept the challenges," it said, "so that you can feel the exhilaration of victory." I saved the image to my desktop. It became my mantra. The isolation was the hardest part. They monitored my mail, listened in on my calls. I had to find a way to maintain a lifeline to the outside world. Twice a week, I'd go to the Fayetteville Public Library, ostensibly to borrow books. There, I'd use their public computers to send brief, coded emails to my commanding officer, just checking in, letting him know I was dealing with a family matter, but that the situation was under control. It was a thin thread, but it was a thread. One day, at the commissary on base, I ran into Corporal Evans, a guy from my platoon. He took one look at me, and the forced smile on my face must have faltered. He saw the fatigue in my eyes, the slight tremor in my hands. He didn't ask questions. He just looked at me, his expression serious, and said, "Sarge, if you need anything, you call, day or night." That simple offer from a battle buddy, that unconditional promise of support, was like a canteen of cool water in the desert. It reminded me that beyond the walls of that house, I wasn't alone. I was still a part of a brotherhood that always has your back. The worst night of the siege came unexpectedly. Robert was drunker than usual. He stumbled into the living room where I was dusting. His eyes fell on the shadow box on the wall, the one where I kept David's medals displayed with the flag from his casket. He ripped it off the wall. The glass shattered on the floor. "What good is this junk?" he slurred, pulling out the medals, the bronze star, the purple heart, and throwing them onto the carpet like trash. Didn't save his damn life, did it? If you've ever felt like you were fighting a battle no one else could see, please hit that like button to show your support. And in the comments, just type the words, "I see you," for every silent warrior out there. Watching him desecrate my husband's honor, I didn't flinch. I just stood there, my face a mask of calm. But inside, the intelligence officer was taking notes, filing away another critical piece of evidence. He thought he was winning. He had no idea he was just handing me the ammunition I needed to win the war. That night, after cleaning up the shattered glass and reverently placing David's medals back in their broken box, I took out Barnaby the bear. As I held the soft, plush symbol of my husband's love, I knew what I had to do. I pulled out the small recorder and whispered to the bear. "David, my love," I murmured into the darkness. "I'm sorry I have to do this, but I'm using our love to protect your legacy." In basic training, they drill into you the importance of situational awareness, always observing your surroundings, identifying potential threats, but also recognizing potential assets. In the isolation of my home, my only asset seemed to be my own discipline. But I was wrong. A strategic asset had been there all along, right next door. His name was Mr. Peterson. He was a quiet man in his 70s who lived alone in the tidy blue house to my left. All I really knew about him was that he was a retired Marine, a fact announced by the pristine Marine Corps flag that flew from his porch every single day, rain or shine. Our interactions were minimal. A polite nod over the fence as he trimmed his rose bushes or as I brought in the groceries. He was just a fixture of the neighborhood, a quiet presence. But as the siege in my home intensified, I started to notice things. Mr. Peterson had an uncanny sense of timing. The afternoon Robert followed me out to the front yard, shouting that I was an ungrateful freeloader. Mr. Peterson suddenly appeared on his lawn with a garden hose to water his petunias. When Eleanor, in a fit of passive-aggressive rage, tossed a bag of trash onto the lawn because I'd forgotten to take the bins to the curb, I saw the reflection of Mr. Peterson in my living room window. He was methodically cleaning his own windows, his gaze lingering for just a moment too long in our direction. He never interfered. He never said a word. But his presence was a constant. It was like having a silent security camera next door, a witness who saw everything. It didn't change my situation, but it changed something in me. It made the isolation feel a fraction less absolute. One morning, I came out to find my car had a flat tire. The driver's side, rear. I stared at it, a cold certainty washing over me. It hadn't been flat last night. I knew, with the kind of instinct you develop in a war zone, that Robert had done this. It was another small act of sabotage, another way to keep me off balance. As I wrestled with the rusty lug nuts on the spare, sweating and cursing under my breath, I heard the quiet click of a gate. Mr. Peterson walked over from his driveway. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't offer platitudes. He simply carried a small professional-looking hydraulic jack and a 4-way lug wrench. Without a word, he knelt on the pavement, positioned the jack, and began to work. I stood there, watching his practiced, efficient movements. 5 minutes later, the spare was on, secure and tight. He stood up, wiping his hands on a rag from his back pocket. He looked at me, his eyes clear and direct. For the first time, I saw the man behind the quiet neighbor. I saw the Marine. He gently patted my shoulder. "You be careful now, Sergeant," he said, his voice a low gravel. He called me Sergeant. Not Sonia, not Honey, not the grieving widow next door. He acknowledged my rank, my identity. His eyes held no pity, only a quiet, profound understanding. He knew more than he was letting on. The confirmation came a few days later. It had been a particularly brutal afternoon. Eleanor had spent hours making passive comments about my inability to keep the house as clean as she liked, a nonstop barrage of quiet insults. I felt raw, exhausted, and utterly defeated. I escaped to the back porch, sinking onto the top step, burying my face in my hands. The loneliness was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe. After a few minutes, I heard a soft clink of glass on wood. I looked up. On his side of the low fence, on his own back steps, Mr. Peterson had placed a tall, sweating glass of iced tea and a small plate of homemade chocolate chip cookies. He caught my eye, gave me a slow, deliberate nod, and then turned and went back inside his house. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The message was as clear as the summer sky. I see you. I know this is hard. I stared at the glass, a lump forming in my throat. I couldn't remember the last time someone had done something for me out of pure, simple kindness. That glass of iced tea, with the condensation trickling down its side, was sweeter than anything I had ever tasted. It was acknowledgement. It was grace. Our first real conversation happened a week after that. I was in the yard, pulling weeds with a vengeance, channeling my frustration into the stubborn roots of dandelions. Mr. Peterson was on his side of the fence, tending to his tomatoes. "That oak tree of yours and the boys is a fine one," he said, his voice carrying easily in the still air. He was looking at the young tree David had planted, the one Eleanor was so determined to destroy. "Got a good, deep root system on it. It'll take one hell of a storm to knock that thing over." I understood immediately. He wasn't just talking about the tree, he was talking about me. A small, genuine smile touched my lips for the first time in what felt like an eternity. "I sure hope so, sir," I replied, my voice a little shaky. The brief exchange solidified the unspoken alliance between us. Two soldiers from two different wars holding the line. The final piece fell into place a few weeks before the night of the kitchen ambush. I was getting the mail when he walked up to his own mailbox. He seemed more serious than usual, his brow furrowed. "Sergeant," he said, his voice low, meant only for me. "Always be mindful of your exit routes." He paused, his gaze sharp. "And remember, walls are thinner than people think." It wasn't casual advice, it was a warning from one combat veteran to another. He was telling me that he could hear things. He was telling me that he knew. And he was telling me that he was there. His words planted a seed of preparation in my mind. They were a reminder that I was not just a victim enduring a siege. I was a soldier who needed a battle plan. The final battle was coming. I could feel it. And thanks to the quiet Marine next door, I knew I wouldn't be facing it completely alone. When I went back inside that day, Eleanor made a comment about me dawdling. I ignored her. I walked to the kitchen and made myself a cup of coffee, and as I stood there, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't happiness, not yet. It was strength. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed, there was a gentle knock at the back door. It was Mr. Peterson. He was holding a freshly baked apple pie in a glass dish, the steam still rising from the lattice crust. "My mother used to say a good pie helps a person think straight," he said simply, handing it to me. "Figured you could use some clear thinking." I took the warm dish, the scent of cinnamon and baked apples filling the air. "Thank you, Mr. Peterson," I managed to say. "Thank you for everything." He just nodded. "Semper Fi, Sergeant." Always faithful. As I closed the door, I knew his gift wasn't just a pie. It was provisions for the fight ahead. The warmth from Mr. Peterson's apple pie felt like a temporary truce, a brief moment of peace in a long and grueling war. But I knew truces don't last. My enemy was regrouping, preparing for a new offensive. Their tactics shifted from overt physical intimidation to a more insidious, multi-pronged assault designed to dismantle not just my resolve, but my very identity. The first front in this new phase was an attack on memory itself. Robert and Eleanor began a systematic purge of David's presence from the house. It was a scorched earth campaign against our shared past. I came home from the base one afternoon to find the bookshelf in the den strangely empty. The rows of paperback novels David had collected, the worn-out military histories he'd read a dozen times, all gone. I found Eleanor in the kitchen, humming as she wiped down the counters. "Where are David's books?" I asked, my voice tight. She didn't even turn around. "Oh, I donated them to the public library," she said breezily. This house needs to be cleared of clutter, Sonia. It's the only way you can move forward. She said it as if she were doing me a favor, as if erasing my husband was an act of kindness. A week later, it was our record collection. David and I had spent years crate digging at flea markets and thrift stores, building a small but beloved collection of vinyl albums. Johnny Cash, Creedence Clearwater Revival, Otis Redding. It was the soundtrack to our marriage. One evening, I went to put on a record and found the entire shelf bare. The turntable was covered in a thin layer of dust. This time, I confronted Robert. He was in his usual spot on the recliner, a beer sweating in his hand. He didn't even try to lie. "Sold 'em," he grunted, taking a long swallow. "Needed the cash for beer." He shrugged, a gesture of such profound disrespect that it stole the breath from my lungs. Each item they removed wasn't just an object. It was a piece of our story, a tangible piece of my husband's soul. And they were liquidating it, piece by piece, right in front of me. With the internal purges underway, Eleanor opened the second front, a public relations campaign to destroy my reputation. She began inviting the neighbors over for iced tea and conversation while I was at work. Her prime target was Mrs. Green from across the street, a woman whose primary hobby was gossip. I saw them one afternoon as I pulled into the driveway. They were sitting on the front porch, Eleanor dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief while Mrs. Green patted her hand with a look of deep, sympathetic concern. Later that week, I understood why. When I saw Mrs. Green at the mailbox, she gave me a look that was a toxic cocktail of pity and fear. The whispers started soon after. I'd be mowing the lawn and see curtains twitch. A quiet conversation at the end of a driveway would stop abruptly as I walked by. They no longer saw Sergeant Blair, the competent soldier, the grieving but strong widow. They saw the character Eleanor had created for them, a poor, unstable woman, shattered by PTSD from her time in the service, prone to fits of rage and paranoid delusions. She'd cleverly woven my military background into her narrative, twisting a source of my pride into a sign of instability. I was no longer a neighbor, I was a ticking time bomb. And Robert and Eleanor were the brave, long-suffering saints trying to manage me. One evening, while scrolling through YouTube, trying to find anything to distract myself, I stumbled across a speech by Brené Brown. She was talking about vulnerability and courage. "Courage starts with showing up and letting ourselves be seen," she said. The words hit me hard. I realized I couldn't keep fighting this war from the shadows, letting them define who I was. I had to be seen. The third front was sabotage, small, insidious acts designed to wear me down financially and mentally. Our water bill tripled one month. I found the spigot in the backyard had been left on, a slow, steady trickle that ran for days. The electric bill soared. Robert had taken to leaving every light in the house on, even when he wasn't in the room. Important mail started to disappear. A notice from my bank regarding a CD David had set up, a letter from my unit about an upcoming training schedule. They never made it to my hands. I knew they were checking the mail first, filtering out anything that might empower me. I felt like the commander of a fortress under siege, but the enemy wasn't outside the walls. They were inside, cutting my supply lines one by one, trying to starve me out. The final, decisive blow of their campaign arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't a fist or a cruel word. It was a manila envelope delivered by a mail carrier who required my signature. Certified mail. My hands trembled as I signed for it. The return address was a law firm downtown. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table Robert had flipped, and tore it open. The language inside was cold, brutal, and ruthlessly efficient. It was a formal letter, printed on heavy cream-colored letterhead. It stated that their clients, Mr. Robert Hale and Mrs. Eleanor Hale, as the next of kin and primary heirs of the late David Hale, were formally requesting that I, Sonia Blair, vacate the premises at 124 Willow Creek Lane within 30 days. This was, the letter explained, to allow for the liquidation of the estate's primary asset, my house, my home. They were calling it an asset. The letter completely ignored the fact that I was David's legal wife. It ignored that my name was on the deed right alongside his. It was written with the chilling, emotionless precision of a legal document designed to erase my entire existence. I read it once, then twice. The words swam before my eyes. This wasn't a drunken threat anymore. This wasn't a whispered, manipulative lie. This was a calculated, legal declaration of war. They had fired the first shot, not with a fist, but with a pen. I folded the letter, my movements slow and deliberate. I placed it on the counter. The rage that had been simmering inside me for months didn't boil over. Instead, it cooled, hardening into something dense and heavy, like steel. The fear was gone. The hurt was gone. All that was left was a pure, cold resolve. They had drawn the battle lines. They had chosen the battlefield. And they had fundamentally misunderstood their opponent. They thought they were evicting a grieving widow. They were about to find out they had declared war on a paratrooper from the 82nd Airborne. And in this war, I would not be retreating. The arrival of the lawyer's letter changed the atmospheric pressure in the house. The air grew thin, charged with electricity, like the moments before a lightning strike. The unspoken truce, fragile as it was, had been officially broken. Open war was declared. Robert transformed from a silent, brooding predator into a caged animal. He paced the length of the living room incessantly, the floorboards groaning under his weight. His drinking intensified, the clink of the whiskey bottle against his glass becoming a constant, menacing rhythm in the background of our lives. Eleanor, on the other hand, retreated into a chilling silence. It was more terrifying than any of Robert's rages. She would watch me from across the room, her eyes gleaming with a smug, triumphant certainty. She believed she had already won. The eviction notice was, in her mind, the final checkmate. They were wrong. On my side of the battlefield, something had shifted too. The fear that had been my constant companion for months had evaporated, burned away by the cold fire of the legal threat. I was no longer just surviving day to day. I was focused, I was alert, I was waiting. In any conflict, you wait for your opponent to overplay their hand, to make a critical, unforced error. I knew they would make one. I just never imagined it would be so profane. The evening it happened, Robert stumbled home hours later than usual. He was roaring drunk, his face a blotchy, furious red. The 30-day notice was halfway to its deadline, and his anger that I hadn't started packing boxes was palpable. He stormed into the living room, his eyes scanning for something to unleash his rage upon. They landed on the mantelpiece above the fireplace. There, sitting in a place of honor, was the polished cherry wood shadow box. Inside, perfectly preserved, was the American flag from David's funeral, folded by an honor guard into a tight, solemn triangle. "What the hell is this still doing here?" he roared, his voice cracking with drunken fury. A primal instinct took over. I moved before I even thought, lunging forward from the armchair where I'd been reading. "Don't you touch that!" But I was too late. With a sweep of his powerful arm, he knocked the shadow box from the mantel. It crashed to the hearth, the wood splintering, the glass shattering. He ripped the lid open and pulled out the flag. He held it for a moment, then, with a guttural cry of rage, he threw it onto the dusty floor. The perfectly folded triangle of stars and stripes, the last thing the military had given me of my husband, lay desecrated on the dirty rug. "He's dead!" Robert screamed, flecks of spittle flying from his lips. "He's dead because of your goddamn army. You and this country, you took him from me. You owe me." In that instant, something inside me didn't just break. It detonated. It wasn't fear that rose up in me. It was the white-hot, righteous fury of a soldier watching a brother's honor being defiled. All the pain, all the humiliation, all the silent endurance of the past year coalesced into a single point of pure, unadulterated rage. I rose from my crouched position. I stood up straight, my shoulders back, my chin up. I faced this man, this giant who had terrorized me, and I was not afraid. My voice, when it came, was not the trembling whisper of a victim. It was the crisp, unwavering command of a non-commissioned officer. "Pick it up." Robert stared at me, his drunken haze momentarily pierced by sheer disbelief. "What did you say to me?" I repeated, my voice dropping lower, each word a block of ice. Pick up that flag. Now. Eleanor, sensing the shift in power, tried to intervene. Sonia, don't you dare take that tone. I whipped my head toward her, and the look in my eyes must have been terrifying because she fell silent. You, I hissed, my voice shaking with a controlled fury. Stay out of this. You both have gone too far. Ignoring them, I knelt. With a reverence that felt like a prayer, I carefully lifted the flag from the floor. My hands moved with the muscle memory of countless ceremonies, brushing away the dust, ensuring its sacred fabric was clean. I clutched it to my chest, a shield and a sacrament, and then I slowly rose to my full height. I looked at the two stunned, pathetic figures before me. The silence in the room was absolute. From this moment on, I said, my voice ringing with an authority they had never heard, this war is no longer being fought in the dark. I took a step forward. They both flinched. I have been silent. I have endured. I have documented everything. Their eyes widened. And now, I am going to show the entire world exactly who you are. I looked from Eleanor's pale, shocked face to Robert's slack-jawed stupor. You have made a fatal mistake, I continued, my voice cold and clear as a bugle call on a winter morning. You have gone to war with a soldier of the United States Army, and that is a war you cannot win. If you believe that there are lines that should never be crossed, hit that like button right now. And in the comments, I want you to type 3 simple words. Defend the flag. Let's show the world what honor looks like. Without another word, I executed a perfect about-face. I marched into my bedroom, the flag held tightly against my heart. I closed the door behind me and turned the lock. The click of the deadbolt echoed in the sudden, deafening silence of the house. I stood there for a moment, my back against the door, my breathing finally catching up to me. The soldier's oath I took to defend the Constitution felt renewed, repurposed. It was now an oath to defend my home, my husband's memory, and my own honor. I walked over to my nightstand, placed the flag down gently, and picked up my phone. My fingers were steady. There was no hesitation. I scrolled through my contacts to the number I had saved weeks ago, just in case. The number for the Fort Liberty Judge Advocate General's office. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear. A calm, professional voice answered on the other end. JAG office, how may I direct your call? I took a deep breath, the first clean breath of freedom I'd had in a year. My name is Sergeant Blair, I said. I need to report an incident. The night after I locked myself in my room was the first night I truly slept in months. It wasn't a peaceful sleep, but it was a sleep of profound, bone-deep resolve. The war had moved from a defensive posture to an offensive one. My mission was no longer to endure, it was to engage. I was up before the sun, slipping out of the house like a ghost, while Robert and Eleanor were still asleep. I didn't drive to the base, not yet. I drove to a small, quiet coffee shop on the other side of Fayetteville, a place with worn-out armchairs and the comforting smell of roasted beans. I sat in a secluded corner, ordered a black coffee I didn't touch, and took a long, centering breath. The motto of the 82nd Airborne is All American. It stands for resilience, for professionalism, for never quitting. I told myself I would honor that motto today. Then, I made the call. Fort Liberty JAG office, how can I help you? I kept my voice low, steady, and professional, stripping every ounce of emotion from it. This was a report, not a plea. This is Sergeant Sonia Blair. I am an active duty soldier experiencing domestic abuse and attempted property fraud from my late husband's family. I have extensive evidence. I require legal assistance. The crisp, no-nonsense tone of my voice must have cut through. There was no shuffling, no transfer to a dozen different departments. The paralegal on the other end was efficient. Understood, Sergeant. We have an opening with Captain Miller at 1400 hours today. Can you make that? I'll be there, I said, and hung up. Captain Miller's office was spare and orderly, just like her. She was a sharp, intelligent woman with perceptive eyes that missed nothing. There was no pity in her gaze, just a calm, professional focus. She motioned for me to sit, and I took the chair opposite her desk. Sergeant Blair, she began. The paralegal gave me a brief overview. Tell me what's happening. This was the moment. This was where I had to be seen, just as Brené Brown had said. But I didn't break down. I didn't weep. The time for that was over. I opened my laptop, took out a flash drive labeled Recipes, and plugged it into the port. Captain, I said, my voice as level as hers. I believe it's better if I show you. I opened the folder. On the screen, a meticulously organized series of files appeared. I started with the photographs. Exhibit A, Physical Evidence. I clicked open the first image, the ugly purple bruise on my elbow from the hallway. Each photo was time-stamped with a digital newspaper headline. I walked her through them chronologically, my voice detached, as if I were giving a battlefield damage assessment. Next, the audio files. They were organized into subfolders: threats, verbal abuse, manipulation. I handed her a pair of headphones. Exhibit B, Psychological Warfare. She put them on, and I pressed play. I watched her face as she listened. I saw her jaw tighten as she heard Robert's drunken slurs. I saw a flicker of cold anger in her eyes as she heard Eleanor's saccharine voice on the phone calling me a little fool. Finally, I showed her the financial records. Bank statements showing that every mortgage payment, every utility bill, had come from my military paycheck. I showed her the eviction letter from their lawyer. I presented my case not as a daughter-in-law, but as a soldier presenting an intelligence briefing to a superior officer. When I was done, I closed the laptop. Captain Miller took off the headphones and sat in silence for a long moment, her fingers steepled in front of her. The only sound in the room was the quiet ticking of a clock on the wall. She looked at me, and for the first time, her professional mask softened, replaced by something else: respect. "You did good work, Sergeant," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Excellent intel gathering under duress." Those words, that simple acknowledgement from one soldier to another, felt like a medal. It was the validation I had been starved for. She didn't see me as a victim. She saw me as a competent professional who had performed her duties under extreme pressure. It was everything. Captain Miller leaned forward, her focus now razor-sharp. She picked up her phone. "I'm calling the Fayetteville Police Department and the Cumberland County District Attorney's Office," she explained, already dialing. "Robert and Eleanor may be civilians, but you are an active duty soldier who has been assaulted. The Army has a vested interest in protecting its own. We'll coordinate a joint approach." She made the call, her conversation brief, direct, and authoritative. After she hung up, she looked at me again. "There's one more person I want to bring into this," she said. "A Mr. Peterson. Your neighbor." The sworn testimony of a retired Marine Corps Vietnam veteran carries an immense amount of weight, both with the police and in a courtroom. I felt a surge of profound relief. I wasn't fighting alone anymore. The entire system, the one I had dedicated my life to, was beginning to move. The gears of justice were starting to turn. Captain Miller stood up and began to pace, not with agitation, but with the focused energy of a commander planning an attack. She started outlining the strategy, her voice crisp and clear. "Okay, Sergeant, here's our plan of attack. Phase 1. Tomorrow morning, we file for an emergency protective order. A judge will grant it based on this evidence. That will force Robert and Eleanor to vacate the house immediately. They won't be allowed within 500 yards of you or the property." She held up a finger. Phase 2. We coordinate with the FPD to press formal criminal charges against Robert for assault. The photos and your testimony are more than enough. Eleanor will be named as an accessory for her role in the intimidation. She stopped pacing and looked directly at me, a cold, thin smile on her lips. Phase 3. We respond to their lawyer's pathetic little letter. Not with a defense, but with a counter-offensive. We'll send him this entire evidence package, along with a countersuit for fraud, property damage, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. She leaned against her desk, the smile widening slightly. "They wanted a legal fight, Sergeant?" For the first time in a year, a real, genuine hope ignited inside me. It wasn't the fragile hope of survival anymore. It was the fierce, burning hope of victory. Captain Miller saw the change in my eyes. She nodded, her expression all business once more. "Sergeant, this wasn't just domestic abuse," she said, her voice dropping, becoming hard as granite. "This was a calculated campaign, and we are going to treat it like one." The battlefield was a conference room in a downtown Fayetteville law office, neutral territory. Captain Miller had explained that this mediation was a final chance for them to surrender before we launched our full-scale assault in court. The room was designed to be calming, with its polished mahogany table, leather chairs, and muted gray walls. But the air was electric with tension. This was not a negotiation. This was a reckoning. Robert and Eleanor walked in with their lawyer, radiating a smug confidence. Robert wore a suit that was too tight in the shoulders, and Eleanor had dressed in somber grays, the picture of a grieving, put-upon mother. They believed they held all the cards. They believed they were moments away from finalizing their victory. I walked in a moment later with Captain Miller at my side. I was in my Class A uniform, perfectly pressed, my ribbons and medals aligned with military precision. I wanted them to see not the broken woman from the kitchen floor, but Sergeant Blair. I sat down, my back ramrod straight, my expression neutral. I was a soldier, and this was my theater of operations. Their lawyer, a slick man with a practiced smile, began the proceedings. "We are here today to resolve this unfortunate family matter amicably," he started, his voice smooth as silk. "My clients, in their grief, have a reasonable request to take possession of their son's primary asset, the house, in order to settle his estate." He continued to drone on, painting a picture of me as an unstable, emotional widow who was obstructing the grieving process. He mentioned my military service with a tone of feigned concern. Given Sergeant Blair's challenging experiences overseas, her current emotional state is understandable, but he was building the narrative Eleanor had so carefully constructed. I could feel Robert and Eleanor preening in their seats. Captain Miller let him finish. She didn't interrupt. She didn't argue. When he was done, she simply reached into her briefcase and placed a small black Bluetooth speaker in the center of the mahogany table. "Before we continue," she said, her voice calm and dangerously quiet, "I think it's important for everyone in this room to hear a few things." She pressed a button on her phone. The first voice that filled the room was Robert's, thick and slurred with whiskey, captured by the teddy bear's hidden microphone. "I'll beat you black and blue if you don't sign it." Their lawyer's smile froze on his face. Robert's confident posture deflated, his shoulders slumping slightly. Captain Miller played the next file. This time, it was Eleanor's voice, clear as a bell, speaking to her sister on the phone. "She's so weak. Just a little more pressure and she'll pack her bags and leave. She's not family." The lawyer's face had gone pale. He shot a furious look at Eleanor, whose hands were now trembling in her lap. "And this one," Captain Miller said, her eyes locked on Eleanor, "is from the night of what your clients describe as Sergeant Blair's clumsy fall." The sounds that followed were horrific in their clarity. The crash of breaking dishes, Robert's guttural scream, and then Eleanor's voice, cold as the grave. "Finish it." Silence descended on the room, heavy and absolute. Robert was now staring at the table, his face a mask of shame. Eleanor was shaking, a faint rattling sound coming from her throat. But Captain Miller wasn't done. She saved the masterstroke for last. Their lawyer, trying to regain some footing, stammered, These recordings could be doctored, taken out of context." Captain Miller's lips curved into a smile that held no warmth. "In that case, let's bring in a witness." And just then, the conference room door opened. Mr. Peterson walked in. He was wearing an old but immaculately kept dark suit, his posture as straight as a flagpole. He looked every inch the retired Marine. He sat down at the end of the table, his presence commanding a new level of gravity in the room. He didn't look at Robert or Eleanor. He looked at the mediator. He recounted with the precise factual language of a soldier giving an after-action report everything he had seen and heard over the past year. The shouting in the front yard, the trash being thrown, the sounds coming through the thin suburban walls. On the night of the incident, he concluded, his voice steady and strong, I heard the sounds of a violent struggle. I've been in combat. I know the difference between a family argument and an assault. His words hung in the air, imbued with the unimpeachable authority of a man who had seen true battle. The weight of his testimony was like steel, crushing the last of their defenses. That was the moment they broke. I watched it happen. The smugness drained from Eleanor's face, replaced by pure, stark terror. Robert looked up, his eyes wide with the realization that he was facing criminal charges, jail time. The entire foundation of their deceit crumbled to dust in a matter of minutes. In war, this is the principle of shock and awe. You overwhelm the enemy with such a decisive, unexpected show of force that their will to fight simply evaporates. Their lawyer, seeing the case disintegrating before his eyes, practically leapt from his chair. We request a brief recess to confer with our clients. He hustled Robert and Eleanor out of the room. Through the glass wall of the conference room, I could see them in the hallway. The lawyer gesturing wildly, Eleanor weeping, Robert looking utterly defeated. When they returned 15 minutes later, they were transformed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, pathetic fear. Their lawyer, now sweating profusely, spoke in a rushed, conciliatory tone. "My clients," he stammered, "are prepared to withdraw their request to vacate the property." Captain Miller just stared at him, saying nothing. "And," he added quickly, "they are willing to sign a permanent restraining order, and to offer compensation for medical bills and property damage." It was a complete and unconditional surrender. Captain Miller slid a set of documents across the table that she had prepared in advance. "Sign them," she said. It wasn't a request. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, my hands folded calmly on the table, and watched them. I watched Robert's trembling hand as he scrawled his name. I watched Eleanor sign, a single tear tracing a path through her makeup. They were signing their defeat. They were signing my freedom. As the pen scratched across the paper, I felt a year's worth of tension, fear, and grief release from my body. It wasn't a sudden explosion, but a slow, quiet unwinding. For the first time since David's death, I felt like I could take a full, deep breath. When it was over, I stood up. Captain Miller gave my shoulder a firm, proud squeeze. I nodded to her, a silent thank you that conveyed everything. I turned and walked toward the door, not looking back at the two broken people I was leaving behind. I pushed the door open and stepped out of the dim, air-conditioned conference room and into the bright, warm North Carolina sunshine. It felt like I was stepping into a different world. As I stood on the pavement, letting the light wash over me, I looked back through the tinted glass. I could see their silhouettes in the darkened room, two figures slumped in their chairs, utterly defeated. I'd walked out into the light, leaving them behind in the shadows they had created. The battle was over. I had won. That afternoon, after Robert and Eleanor had been escorted from my property by two Fayetteville police officers, I walked back into my house alone. I had expected to feel a surge of triumph, a wave of elation. But that's not what came. As the front door clicked shut behind me, the silence that filled the rooms was overwhelming. It was no longer the menacing silence of Robert's glares or Eleanor's disapproval. It was a new kind of silence, vast, empty, and heavy with the ghosts of the war that had just been won. I didn't feel like a victor. I felt exhausted, right down to my bones. The adrenaline that had sustained me for months drained away, leaving behind a profound weariness. I walked slowly through the living room, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. I ran a hand along the back of the sofa, noticing the faint indentations where they used to sit. I walked into the kitchen, my eyes drawn to the spot on the floor where my head had hit the linoleum. The battle was over, but the battlefield was still here, littered with invisible scars. I sank to the floor in that very spot, pulling my knees to my chest. And for the first time in over a year, I let myself truly cry. The tears weren't for the pain or the fear. They were for the loss. I cried for David, for the future we were supposed to have in this house. I cried for the family I thought I had, the one that should have sheltered me in my grief, but instead tried to destroy me. And I cried for the part of myself, the naive, trusting part that died on this very kitchen floor. I gave myself that one day to grieve the wreckage, to let the full weight of the loss wash over me. The next morning, I woke up with the sun. The grief was still there, a dull ache in my chest, but something else had returned. The soldier. After a day of allowing myself to be a casualty, it was time to reclaim my territory. I began a new mission, a new campaign, Operation Reclaim. My first act was to throw open every single window in the house. I let the fresh North Carolina breeze blow through, chasing out the stale, stagnant air of conflict. Then, I began to purge. With a box of heavy-duty black trash bags, I went from room to room, collecting every trace of Robert and Eleanor. The cheap porcelain knickknacks Eleanor had placed on my shelves, the half-empty bottles of whiskey Robert had stashed in the den, the magazines and newspapers they'd left scattered on the coffee table. I was ruthless. I didn't pause, I didn't reminisce. I simply gathered up their presents, tied it off in black plastic, and hauled it to the curb without a shred of ceremony. Next, I went to the hardware store. I bought 2 gallons of sea salt paint, the same color David and I had chosen together. I spent the rest of the day with a roller in my hand, covering the walls that had witnessed so much misery. I paid special attention to the spot in the living room, carefully spackling and sanding the crack before applying a fresh, clean coat. Each stroke of the roller was a deliberate act of reclamation. I was physically and spiritually cleansing my space, painting over the darkness with light. A week later, a letter arrived. The envelope was a soft pastel blue, the handwriting on the front instantly recognizable as Eleanor's. My first instinct was to burn it, unopened. But I knew I had to face it. I sat at my newly cleaned kitchen table and slid it open. The letter was 5 pages long, filled with looping, tear-stained cursive. It was a masterpiece of manipulation. She wrote of her unbearable regret, of how grief had made her, not herself. She begged for my forgiveness. She invoked David's name repeatedly, asking me to find it in my heart, for his sake, to give them another chance, to let them be a family again. I read the letter calmly, my heart rate never changing. A year ago, these words would have shattered me, filled me with guilt and self-doubt. But now I could see the architecture of the lie. Her apology wasn't born from remorse, it was born from defeat. She wasn't sorry for what she did. She was sorry she got caught. I didn't write back. Instead, I took out a small leather-bound journal. On a clean page, I wrote a letter to myself. I forgive them, I wrote. Not because they deserve it, but because I deserve peace. My forgiveness is a door. I am walking through it, and I am locking it behind me. My mom used to quote the Bible to me when I was struggling. Philippians 4:13. I can do all things through him who gives me strength. I always thought it was about the strength to fight. Now I realized it was also about the strength to let go. After I put the journal away, I went into the kitchen. I pulled out my mother's old recipe box and found the worn, flour-dusted card for her apple pie. I spent the afternoon peeling apples, rolling out dough, filling my clean, quiet house with the warm, comforting scent of cinnamon and baking. When the pie was cooled, I carried it next door. Mr. Peterson answered on the first knock. He stood in the doorway, his quiet presence as steady and reassuring as ever. I held out the pie. I wanted to thank you, Mr. Peterson, I said, my voice thick with an emotion I couldn't name. For everything. He looked from the pie to my face, and his eyes held a universe of understanding. He took the warm dish from my hands. No thanks needed, Sergeant, he replied, his voice a low, kind rumble. We always have each other's six. We stood there for a moment in the fading sunlight, a silent acknowledgement passing between 2 soldiers who had seen combat of different kinds. I had lost the family I was born into by marriage, a family built on lies and greed. But in its place, I had found something truer, something forged in honor and quiet courage. I had found a brother in arms. I walked back to my own porch and sat on the steps, watching the sunset. The war was over. The long, difficult process of rebuilding was just beginning. I took out my phone, went to my contacts, and found the entry for Eleanor Hale. I held my thumb over the screen for a second, then pressed delete contact. I did the same for Robert. It was a small, simple action, but it felt like the final, definitive act of liberation. The ghosts were gone. The house was quiet. And for the first time in a very long time, it was mine. 6 months after the final battle, my house was unrecognizable. Not because the furniture had changed, but because the very air inside it had. It was no longer the besieged outpost of peace or the blood-soaked battlefield. It had been transformed into something new. It had become a fortress of hope. David's oak tree in the backyard stood taller and stronger, its leaves casting a dappled shade on the lawn. Beneath it, I had placed a small wooden bench. It was my favorite spot to sit with a book and a cup of coffee in the early morning, watching the world wake up. The tree, once a symbol of a future that was stolen, was now a testament to endurance. Its roots held fast. Inside, the house was filled with light and life. The walls, once scarred, were now adorned with new photographs. There was one of me and my platoon after a grueling field exercise, all of us muddy and grinning. There was another of me crossing the finish line of the Army 10-miler, a charity marathon I'd run in Washington, D.C. There was a picture of me receiving a commendation medal from my commanding officer. David was still here, of course. His picture sat on my nightstand, his smile as bright as ever. But the house was no longer a shrine to a painful past. It was a living testament to a vibrant future. Over the fireplace mantel, where the shadow box containing his flag now rested safely in my bedroom, I had hung a simple, carved wooden plaque. It held a quote from Maya Angelou, words that had become my compass. And still, I rise. It was in this renewed space that I discovered my scars had a purpose beyond my own healing. I realized my story, the systematic documentation, the strategic patience, the courage to finally speak up, was not just my story. It was a weapon, it was a map, and I had a duty to share it. I started volunteering at the Family Support Center on Fort Liberty. At first, I just sat in on small support groups for military spouses, listening more than I spoke. But one day, a young wife was describing the subtle, controlling behavior of her husband. The way he isolated her from her friends, the way he made her feel like she was crazy. And I heard my own story in hers. So I spoke. I told them everything. Not the emotional details, but the practical ones. I talked about my recipes folder. I explained how to use a newspaper to timestamp a photograph of a bruise. I described how to turn a simple teddy bear into an intelligence-gathering device. The women in that room listened with a desperate, hungry attention. They weren't hearing a victim's lament. They were hearing a soldier's strategy. My commanding officer heard about what I was doing. He called me into his office, and to my surprise, he didn't tell me to stop. He told me to expand. He recognized the value in my experience. He asked me to develop a formal workshop, a training seminar for soldiers and their spouses. We called it Operation Safe Haven. It was a class designed to teach people how to recognize the subtle tactics of domestic abuse, how to gather evidence legally and safely, and how to navigate the system, both military and civilian, to get help. I had turned my personal hell into a training manual for others. The first workshop was packed. As I stood in front of that room, I wasn't just Sergeant Blair, the paratrooper. I was Sonia, the survivor. And I found a new sense of purpose, a mission that felt as vital and important as any I had undertaken in the Army. One evening, a few months later, my phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered, and on the other end was the trembling voice of a young private, a woman who had been in my first workshop. "Sergeant Blair?" she whispered, her voice cracking. I was in your class, and it's happening to me. Just like you said, I don't know what to do." There was no hesitation. The path forward was clear. "What's your address, Private?" I asked, my voice calm and steady. "I'm on my way." That night, under the cover of darkness, I drove to her off-base apartment. I helped her pack a single bag with her most important documents and a few personal items. I drove her to a secure shelter for abused women. As I left her in the care of the counselors there, I knew with absolute certainty that this was my calling. I had become the person I'd so desperately needed that night on my kitchen floor. I was the cavalry. The story comes full circle exactly 1 year after the ambush. I was at home, sitting at my kitchen table, reviewing my notes for the next Operation Safe Haven workshop. The doorbell rang. When I opened it, I saw the young private I had rescued a year ago. But she wasn't a frightened girl anymore. She stood tall, her eyes clear and confident. She was in her uniform, looking sharp and professional. She'd come to thank me, to tell me she had successfully divorced her abusive husband, gotten a promotion, and was starting a new life. We hugged on the front porch, a long, heartfelt embrace between two soldiers. As she walked away, her head held high, I stood there for a long time, looking out at my quiet street. I glanced at David's oak tree, its branches reaching for the sky. I knew then that the war is never truly over. It just moves to a new front. But I was no longer fighting for my own survival. I was fighting for all the silent soldiers, the ones trapped in battles behind closed doors. And here, in my fortress of hope, under the watchful memory of the man I would always love, I had finally found more than just peace. I had found my purpose. My battle in that kitchen is over, but I know that for so many, the fight is just beginning. If there is one thing I want you to take away from my journey, it is this. Your voice is your greatest weapon, and your story has the power to become a fortress for others. You are not invisible, and you are not alone. Thank you for being here, for listening. If my story resonated with you, please hit that like button to help it reach others who need to hear it. And if you believe in the power of turning scars into strength, subscribe to join our community. Finally, to create a wave of hope for everyone reading, please leave a simple comment below. And still, I rise. Because that is what we do.